The November air carried the scent of rain and dying leaves. Martin Calder stood 3 feet from his daughter's coffin, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression carved from stone. The funeral home's carpet muffled footsteps, but he heard them all. The shuffle of uncomfortable guests, the whispers behind cupped hands, the quiet sobs from people who barely knew Lynn. 54 years old, and Martin had buried both parents, a brother, his wife to cancer 10 years back. He understood grief. He knew its weight, its texture, the way it settled into your bones and changed the way you move through the world. But this was different. This was wrong. Every instinct he possessed screamed that his daughter's death at 28 years old, found at the bottom of her basement stairs with a broken neck, was not an accident. The police report said she fell. Simple as that. A tragic slip on a Tuesday evening while doing laundry. Ronald, her husband of 3 years, had been upstairs watching television. He didn't hear anything until he came down to ask about dinner. Martin's jaw tightened. He'd read that report 5 times, each word burning itself into his memory. The investigating officer had spent less than 2 hours at the scene. No follow-up questions. No deeper inquiry. Just a polite expression of sympathy and a form to sign. Across the room, Ronald Page moved between clusters of mourners. He wore a dark suit that fit him perfectly, his brown hair combed back, his face arranged in an expression of bewildered grief. Martin watched him place a hand on an elderly woman's shoulder, watched him nod solemnly at something she said, watched him glance toward the coffin with wet eyes. Performance. Every gesture calculated. Such a tragedy, Ronald was saying to a couple Martin didn't recognize. His voice carried just enough to be overheard. She'd been having mood swings lately. The stress from work, you know. I try to help, but... He trailed off, shaking his head. She wouldn't talk to me about it. Martin's fingernails dug into his palms. Mood swings. Ronald had used that phrase 8 times already this afternoon. Martin had counted. Each time, he said it with the same tone of loving concern, the same slight bewilderment, as if Lynn had been some fragile creature who'd simply come apart under normal life pressures. Clara Page, Ronald's mother, stood near the refreshment table. She was 62, thin as a rail, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her black dress looked expensive, tailored. She held a teacup in both hands and spoke in low tones to another woman Martin vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. It's terrible, of course, Clara was saying, her voice pitched just loud enough for Martin to hear. But Lynn never could handle responsibility. Marriage is hard work, you understand. Some people simply aren't built for it. The woman beside her made a sympathetic sound. Clara continued, warming to her subject. Ronald tried so hard with her, so patient, but she was always so emotional, unpredictable. I told Ronald from the beginning that she needed to grow up, learn to manage a household properly. You can't blame him for her instability. Martin turned away before he did something he'd regret. His hands trembled with the effort of staying still, staying quiet, of not crossing that room and telling Clara Page exactly what he thought of her and her son. But not yet. Not here. He had a feeling, bone deep and certain, that there was more to learn, more to uncover. Lynn deserved better than a scene at her funeral. She deserved the truth. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. Martin pulled it out, glanced at the screen. The caller ID showed a number he recognized. The urgent care clinic where Lynn had worked as a nurse for the past 4 years. Everett Knox, her manager. Martin stepped into the funeral home's hallway and answered. Yes, Mr. Calder. Everett's voice was tight, strained. I'm sorry to call you during. I know today is, but I discovered something in Lynn's desk. You need to come to the clinic right now. What kind of something? I can't discuss it over the phone. Everett paused, and Martin heard him take a shaky breath. Please, Mr. Calder, don't tell Ronald or Clara you're coming here. You might be in danger if you do. The words hit Martin like a punch. Danger? Just come. Please. As soon as you can. The line went dead. Martin stood in the empty hallway, the phone still pressed to his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the doorway, he could see Ronald standing beside Lynn's coffin now, one hand resting on the polished wood, his head bowed. The picture of a grieving husband. Martin pocketed his phone and walked back into the viewing room. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't acknowledge Ronald or Clara. He simply turned and left through the front entrance into the cold afternoon air and drove straight to Pine Brook Urgent Care. The clinic occupied a squat brick building at the edge of town, sandwiched between a pharmacy and an accountant's office. Martin had been here dozens of times over the years, bringing Lynn lunch during her shifts, picking her up when her car was in the shop, attending the staff holiday parties she'd insisted he come to because you need to get out more, Dad. The parking lot was nearly empty on a Saturday. Martin pulled into a spot near the entrance and sat for a moment, staring at the building. His hands gripped the steering wheel. Whatever Everett had found, it was serious enough to make him use the word danger. Serious enough to warn Martin away from Ronald and Clara. He got out of the car and walked to the front door. It was locked. The clinic didn't open on weekends, but through the glass he saw Everett waiting in the lobby. The man was 46, graying at the temples, usually calm and collected. Today he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, and when he unlocked the door to let Martin in, his hand shook. "Thank you for coming," Everett said. He relocked the door behind them, checked it twice. "I'm sorry to pull you away from. Just show me what you found." Everett nodded and led him down a hallway Martin knew well. They passed the exam rooms, the supply closet, the break room where Lynn used to heat up her lunch. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Clean, orderly, fluorescent lights humming overhead. But the normalcy felt wrong, like walking through a house where someone had just died and nothing had been disturbed yet. They stopped at a small office near the back of the building. Everett's office. Inside, standing near the window with her arms wrapped around herself, was Nora Hensley, Lynn's best friend since high school. She looked up when Martin entered, and her eyes were red from crying. She held a paper coffee cup in both hands, gripping it so tightly the sides had crumpled. "Mr. Calder," she whispered. Martin had always liked Nora. She was genuine, kind-hearted, one of the few people who'd stuck with Lynn through everything. Right now, she looked terrified. "Sit down," Everett said, gesturing to a chair. Martin remained standing. Everett sighed, moved behind his desk, and picked up a manila envelope. It was thick, sealed with packing tape. Someone had written Lynn's name across the front in black marker, along with 2 words, "if needed." "I found this in the bottom drawer of her desk," Everett said quietly. She kept it hidden under some old training manuals. "I was cleaning out her space yesterday, and—" He trailed off, set the envelope on the desk. "I opened it. I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have, but I opened it." Martin stared at the envelope. His throat felt tight. Everett broke the seal and pulled out the contents. Photographs spilled across the desk. Martin stepped closer, leaned down, and felt the air leave his lungs. Bruises, purple and yellow marks across pale skin. Lynn's skin, her upper arm in one photo, mottled with fingerprint-shaped contusions. Her shoulder in another, the side of her ribs, her wrist. Each image was dated in the corner, some from 6 months ago, others more recent. The most recent was from 3 weeks before her death. "There's more," Everett said. His voice shook. He pulled out several sheets of paper, handwritten notes in Lynn's careful print. Martin recognized her handwriting immediately, neat, precise, each letter formed with the same care she'd put into everything. The notes were a list, dates and brief descriptions. March 14th, argument about dinner. Or grabbed my arm when I tried to leave the room. April 2nd, Clara called me lazy for being tired after a double shift. Or agreed with her. May 18th, or took my car keys. Said I didn't need to visit you this weekend. June 9th, fight about money. Or pushed me. Bruise on shoulder blade. July 23rd, Clara told me I'm embarrassing their family. The list went on, page after page. Martin's vision blurred as he read, his hands trembling as he held the papers. Nora made a small, choked sound. "I told her to leave him," she said, her voice breaking. "I begged her to leave. She said she couldn't. She said Ronald would make it worse if she tried." Martin looked up at her. "You knew. Not everything. Not." Nora gestured helplessly at the photos. "She told me he had a temper. That Clara was cruel to her. That she felt trapped. She made me promise not to tell anyone, especially not you. She didn't want you to worry. She thought she could handle it. Handle it. Martin's voice came out flat, emotionless. Inside, something was breaking apart, sharp-edged and violent. Everett reached into the envelope again and pulled out a small flash drive. There's this too. I haven't listened to it yet. I thought you should be the first one. Martin took the drive. The plastic felt warm from Everett's hand. He turned it over in his palm, stared at it. She came here the night before she died. Everett continued. It was late, after a shift. I was finishing up paperwork. She knocked on my office door and asked if she could leave something with me. Something important. She said, he swallowed hard. She said, if something happens to me, give this to my dad. Don't give it to Ronald. Don't let Clara see it. Just my dad. The room went very quiet. Martin could hear the hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic outside, his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. I asked her what she meant, Everett said. If something happens. She just smiled at me. This sad, tired smile. And she said, just in case. He pressed his palms against the desk. I should have done more. I should have asked more questions. I should have. You kept this safe? Martin interrupted. That's what she asked you to do. He looked down at the flash drive again, then at the photos, the notes, the evidence of his daughter's suffering laid out on a desk in an empty clinic. Ronald's voice echoed in his memory. Mood swings, stress from work, wouldn't talk to me about it. Clara's tight-lipped condemnation, couldn't handle responsibility, too emotional, never could manage properly. All lies, all of it calculated to cover up what they'd done to her, what they'd driven her to. Nora stepped closer, her coffee cup forgotten on the windowsill. She wanted to leave him, Mr. Calder. She was looking for her own apartment. She asked me to help her start searching online because she was afraid Ronald would see her search history. She was planning to tell you after she'd moved out. She didn't want to burden you with it until she was already gone. When? Martin asked. What? When was she planning to leave? Nora's face crumbled. She said soon. Maybe after Christmas. She wanted to save up enough money first because she knew Ronald would try to fight her on everything. And Clara. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Clara kept telling her that divorce was shameful, that she'd be a failure if she left, that no one would respect her anymore. Martin closed his eyes, breathed in slowly through his nose, out through his mouth. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened into something cold and unmovable. I need to take this with me, he said, gesturing to the envelope. All of it, of course. Everett handed it over immediately. Mr. Calder, if you need anything, if there's anything I can do, don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Martin tucked the envelope under his arm. Not Ronald, not Clara, not the police. No one. You're going to do something, Nora said. It wasn't a question. Martin looked at her directly. I'm going to find out exactly what happened to my daughter, and then I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth. He left the clinic with the envelope, climbed back into his car, and drove home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Beautiful. Lynn had always loved sunsets. She used to drag him up to the hill on the north side of town when she was a teenager, just to watch the light change. His house was quiet when he arrived. He'd lived here for 30 years, raised Lynn here after her mother died, watched her graduate high school in the backyard, helped her pack for college. The walls held decades of memories. Tonight, they felt empty. Martin went straight to his study, closed the door, and sat down at his desk. He pulled out his laptop, inserted the flash drive, and waited for the files to load. There were 6 audio recordings, all dated within the past 3 months. He clicked on the first one. Lynn's voice filled the room, soft and strained in a way that made Martin's chest tighten. Dad, I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I hope you won't. I hope I'm just being paranoid, keeping these recordings like some kind of insurance policy. But I need to say it out loud. I need someone to know, even if it's just my computer. A pause. Martin could hear her breathing, uneven. Ronald took my keys again today. He said I didn't need to go anywhere without telling him first. He wasn't angry when he said it. That's the worst part. He just said it like it was normal, like he had every right. And when I argued, he grabbed my wrist. Not hard enough to leave a mark this time, but hard enough that I knew he could if he wanted to. Another pause. Longer. Clara called me this afternoon. She wanted to know why I hadn't cleaned the house properly yesterday. I worked a 14-hour shift, Dad. I was exhausted, but she said that wasn't an excuse. She said I was embarrassing them, that I needed to do better. And Ronald just stood there nodding while she talked, agreeing with every word. The recording ended. Martin sat perfectly still. His hands rested on the desk, fingers splayed. He clicked on the second recording. "It's getting worse," Lynn said. Her voice sounded even more tired this time. "I can't do anything right anymore. Clara criticizes everything. The way I cook, the way I clean, the way I talk to their friends. Ronald says I'm too sensitive, that I'm overreacting. But Dad, I'm not. I know I'm not. They're isolating me. Every time I want to see you or Nora, there's some reason I shouldn't go. Some excuse. Some obligation they've created. A shaky breath. I'm scared. That's the truth. I'm scared of what will happen if I try to leave. Ronald told me last week that if I ever embarrassed him by leaving, he'd make sure everyone in town knew how unstable I was. He said no one would believe me over him. And maybe he's right. Maybe." Her voice broke. Martin heard her crying softly, trying to muffle it. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I thought I could fix this. I thought if I just tried harder, if I was better, if I could make Clara like me. But it's not about that. It was never about that. They wanted someone they could control. And I let them." The second recording ended. Martin's jaw ached from clenching it. He clicked on the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Each one painted the same picture. Escalating control, emotional abuse, physical intimidation. Ronald's temper getting worse. Clara's constant degradation. Lynn's growing fear. The sixth recording was dated 2 days before her death. When Lynn spoke this time, her voice was different. Not scared anymore. Resolved. "Dad, if you're listening to this, it means something happened to me. And I need you to know it wasn't an accident. Whatever they told you, whatever story they came up with, it's a lie." Martin's breath caught. Ronald's been getting more aggressive. "Last night, we had a fight about money. I wanted to transfer some of my paycheck into my own account, and he lost it. He grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me. Clara was there. She saw the whole thing. And afterward, she told me I shouldn't provoke him, that I was pushing him too far." Lynn's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "I'm going to leave. I've made up my mind. Nora is helping me look for places. I've started hiding money. I'm going to tell Ronald after Christmas, and then I'm just going to go. I don't care what Clara says. I don't care if the whole town thinks I'm a failure. I can't live like this anymore." A long pause. Traffic sounds in the background. "If anything happens to me before then, please don't let them tell my story. Don't let them make me into some tragic, unstable woman who couldn't handle married life. I was trying to survive. That's all. I was trying to find a way out." Her voice softened. "I love you, Dad. I'm sorry for all of this. I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to tell you the truth while I could still fix it. But if you're hearing this, please, make them pay." The recording ended. The study fell silent except for the faint hum of the laptop fan. Martin sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. The sun had set completely now. The room had grown dark around him. He didn't turn on a light. He just sat in the darkness, Lynn's voice echoing in his mind. Make them pay. He would. He closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, Pine Brook stretched out in the gathering night. Quiet streets, lit windows, ordinary lives continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. His daughter was dead, murdered, not by a single violent act, but by months of calculated cruelty, by isolation and control and systematic destruction of her sense of self, until she died trying to escape it. And Ronald and Clara were out there right now, playing their roles. The grieving husband, the concerned mother-in-law, both of them weaving their narrative about Lynn's instability, her mood swings, her inability to handle the pressures of adult life. Not anymore. Martin turned away from the window. He picked up his phone and began making a list of everything he needed to do. First, document everything. Make copies of the recordings, the photos, the notes. Store them in multiple locations. Then investigate. Find out what the police knew, what they'd overlooked, what evidence might still exist. Talk to neighbors. Talk to Lynn's co-workers. Build a complete picture of what her life had been like in that house. And then, only then, would he decide exactly how to destroy the people who destroyed his daughter. He worked through the night, making copies, organizing files, creating a timeline of events based on Lynn's notes and recordings. By the time dawn broke over Pine Brook, Martin Calder had transformed from a grieving father into something harder, something purpose-driven and relentless. The funeral had been yesterday. Today, the real work began. The Page's house sat at the end of Oak Street, a two-story colonial with white siding and black shutters. A maple tree dominated the front yard, its branches bare now in late November. Martin had been here dozens of times over the past 3 years. Holiday dinners, birthday celebrations, Sunday brunches that Clara insisted on hosting. He'd always felt uncomfortable in this house, though he'd never been able to articulate exactly why. Now he knew. The discomfort had been instinct recognizing something wrong beneath the perfect surface. He parked his truck 3 houses down and waited. It was Tuesday morning, 9:30. Ronald would be at work. He kept regular hours at the insurance office downtown. Clara usually left around 10 for her weekly bridge game at the community center. Martin had made note of their schedules over the years, storing away details he hadn't realized would matter until now. At 9:58, Clara's silver sedan backed out of the driveway. Martin watched her turn left at the corner and disappear. He counted to 60, then got out of his truck and walked up the street with purpose, as if he had every right to be there. Neighbors who might be watching would assume he was checking on his son-in-law, offering support during this difficult time. The spare key was where Lynn had told him it would be, under a ceramic frog near the back porch steps. She'd mentioned it once, years ago, saying Clara made her keep a spare outside in case she got locked out. "Like I'm a child who can't be trusted with keys," Lynn had said, laughing it off. Martin hadn't understood the bitterness in her voice then. He did now. He let himself in through the back door and stood for a moment in the kitchen. Everything was pristine, counters wiped clean, dishes put away, not a single item out of place. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, along with something floral. Clara's perfume. Martin moved through the kitchen into the dining room, then the living room. Each space looked like something out of a magazine. No clutter, no personality, no sign that real people lived here. The staircase rose along the left wall. Martin climbed slowly, his footsteps muffled by thick carpet. At the top, a hallway stretched in both directions. He knew the master bedroom was to the right, Ronald and Lynn's room. To the left was a guest room, a bathroom, and the small bedroom that had been Lynn's before she married. Martin turned left. Lynn's old bedroom door was closed. He opened it and stepped inside and immediately felt the wrongness of the space. The walls were painted pale yellow, a color Clara had chosen when Lynn was 15. The furniture was the same set from her teenage years. White dresser, white desk, white bookshelf. The bedspread was cream-colored, perfectly smooth. No posters on the walls. No photos on the nightstand. No personal items anywhere. Clara had never let Lynn change anything. Martin remembered arguments about it. Lynn wanting to repaint, wanting to rearrange, wanting to make the space feel like hers. Clara always had reasons why she couldn't. The yellow was cheerful. The furniture was expensive. The room was fine as it was. After Lynn moved out for college, Clara had kept it exactly the same, saying it was important to preserve her childhood. But this wasn't preservation. It was control. Even after Lynn married and moved into the master bedroom down the hall, this space remained frozen, a monument to Clara's refusal to let her grow up. Martin closed the door behind him and began searching. He checked the desk drawers first, empty except for some old pens and a stack of blank note cards. The dresser drawers were similarly bare. The closet held only winter coats on hangers. He knelt beside the bed and looked underneath. Dust bunnies. A shoebox pushed against the far wall. Martin pulled the box toward him and lifted the lid. Inside, packed carefully, was exactly what he'd hoped to find. A journal with a worn leather cover. Bank statements printed from Lynn's computer, folded and stacked. More photographs, some duplicates of what had been in the envelope at the clinic, others new. And a letter, sealed in an envelope with Dad, written across the front in Lynn's handwriting. Martin sat back against the bed and opened the letter. His hands were steady, but his heart hammered in his chest. "Dad, I'm writing this because I need you to understand, and I'm afraid I won't have the courage to tell you face to face. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. Or maybe it means I finally found the strength to leave and wanted you to know why. I didn't fail at marriage. That's what Clara will tell everyone. That's what Ronald will say. But it's not true. They failed me. From the beginning, they saw me as something to mold, to control, to fix. I was never enough for them. Never clean enough, never organized enough, never submissive enough. Ronald wasn't always bad. That's what makes this so hard to explain. He was sweet when we were dating, attentive. He made me feel special. But after the wedding, something changed. Or maybe it didn't change. Maybe I just finally saw what had always been there. He needed someone he could manage. And when I showed any independence, any personality that didn't fit what he wanted, he got angry. The first time he grabbed me hard enough to bruise, I told myself it was an accident. He apologized. He cried. He said he'd been stressed at work. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. The second time, I didn't have that excuse anymore. And by then, Clara had made it clear that if I complained, if I made waves, I would be the problem. Not Ronald. Never Ronald. I tried to be better. I tried so hard, Dad. I thought if I could just figure out what they wanted, if I could become the person they needed me to be, everything would be okay. But it was never about what I did. It was about power, about keeping me small and scared and dependent. I don't know how this ends. I'm going to try to leave, but I'm terrified of what happens if I do. Ronald's threatened me. He says he'll ruin my reputation, make sure everyone knows I'm unstable, turn you against me. Clara backs him up on everything. She's told me that leaving would be shameful, that I'd be a failure, that I'd prove I was never good enough for their family in the first place. But I can't stay. I'm disappearing inside this house, inside this marriage. I'm becoming a ghost of myself. So I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to try. If something happens to me, please know that I didn't fall down the stairs by accident. I didn't have a tragic mishap. Whatever they tell you, it's a lie designed to protect themselves. They're very good at lying, Dad. They've had a lot of practice. I love you. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth sooner. I didn't want you to think I'd failed. But I see now that staying silent was its own kind of failure. I should have trusted you. I should have asked for help. Please don't let them win. Lynn. Martin read the letter 3 times. Each word carved itself into his memory. When he finally folded it carefully and placed it back in a shoebox, his hands were shaking, not with grief now, but with rage. Cold, focused rage that settled into his bones like permafrost. He took out his phone and photographed every item in the box. The journal pages, the bank statements showing Lynn had been slowly transferring small amounts of money to a separate account Ronald didn't know about. The photos of bruises, each one dated and labeled with a brief note about what had happened. Then he packed everything back into the shoebox, replaced the lid, and slid it back under the bed exactly where he'd found it. He stood and looked around the room one more time. This cheerful yellow prison. This monument to Clara's need for control. You didn't fail, Martin said quietly to the empty room. They did. He left the house the same way he'd entered, locking the back door and replacing the key under the ceramic frog. The street was quiet. No one watching. He walked back to his truck, climbed in, and sat there for a moment, staring at the Pages' house through the windshield. They thought they'd gotten away with it. They thought their story about Lynn's instability and tragic accident would stand. They'd underestimated him. Underestimated Lynn, too. She'd been smarter than they realized, documenting everything, leaving evidence scattered in places they'd never think to look. Martin started the truck and drove toward the clinic. He called Everett this morning, told him he needed to meet with him and Nora again. There was work to do, a case to build. Justice didn't happen by itself. You had to construct it piece by piece, brick by brick, until the structure was solid enough to withstand any challenge. Everett and Nora were waiting in the same office where they'd met before. This time, they both looked more composed. Nora had coffee for all 3 of them. Everett had a legal pad and pen ready. They knew Martin was serious. They knew this was the beginning of something. I listened to the recordings, Martin said, sitting down and accepting the coffee. All of them. And I found more evidence at the house this morning. Nora's eyes widened. You went to their house. While they were gone, I found a journal Lynn kept hidden, along with more photos and bank statements. He pulled out his phone and showed them the pictures he'd taken. She was planning to leave. She'd been saving money. She documented everything. Everett leaned forward, studying the phone screen. His expression hardened as he scrolled through the images. This is systematic abuse. Months of it. Years, probably, Martin corrected. These are just the parts she wrote down. There's no telling what else happened that she didn't document. Nora pressed her hands to her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I should have done more. I should have made her leave sooner. She had to make that choice herself, Martin said. And she was trying to. She was going to leave after Christmas. She told you that, right? Nora nodded. We'd found 3 apartments she liked. She was going to look at them in person next month. She said she just needed a little more time to save up and plan. But Ronald found out somehow, Everett said quietly, or suspected, and he made sure she didn't get the chance. Martin's jaw tightened. That's what I think too. The timing is too convenient. She's planning to leave, and suddenly she has a fatal accident in her own house. He shook his head. No, that's not how this happened. So what do we do? Nora asked. She looked at Martin with an expression that was half hope, half desperation. The police already closed the case. They're not going to reopen it just because we say it wasn't an accident. The local police won't, Martin agreed. But the county sheriff's department might, especially if we give them enough evidence to warrant a new investigation. Everett straightened in his chair. You want to go over the Pine Brook Police Department's head. I want to go to someone who will actually look at the facts instead of taking Ronald's word for everything. Martin set his coffee down and leaned forward. The investigating officer spent less than 2 hours at the scene. He talked to Ronald, looked at the stairs, wrote it up as an accident. No interviews with neighbors. No follow-up questions. Nothing. Officer Davidson, Everett said. He and Ronald play golf together. Martin's expression darkened. Of course they do. So we need an outside investigator, Nora said. Someone who doesn't have ties to the pages. Exactly. Martin pulled the envelope Everett had given him from his bag and set on the desk. We have Lynn's recordings. We have her notes documenting the abuse. We have photographs of injuries. We have her letter stating she feared for her safety. We have witness testimony from both of you about her state of mind and her plans to leave. That's enough to at least raise serious questions about whether her death was really an accident. Everett picked up his pen and started making notes. The county sheriff is Eleanor Madsen. I don't know her personally, but she has a good reputation. Fair. Thorough. If you bring this to her, I think she'll listen. Then that's where we start. Martin looked at both of them seriously. But once we do this, there's no going back. Ronald and Clara will know we're coming after them. They'll try to discredit us, discredit Lynn, make this whole thing disappear. They'll use every connection they have, every bit of influence. It's going to get ugly. Good, Nora said fiercely. Let it get ugly. They deserve worse than ugly. Everett nodded. Lynn trusted me with that flash drive for a reason. She knew I'd make sure it got to the right people. I'm not backing down now. Martin felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. He'd been prepared to do this alone if necessary. But having allies made the path ahead feel less impossible. All right, he said. Let's build the case properly. I want to go through Lynn's journal page by page. Document every incident she recorded. Cross-reference it with the photos and voice recordings. Build a timeline that shows the escalation of abuse. Then we compile witness statements from both of you and anyone else who might have seen or heard something. They spent the next 4 hours in that office, going through every piece of evidence with meticulous care. Lynn's journal was heartbreaking. Page after page of hurt and fear and desperate attempts to make sense of her situation. She'd written about the small cruelties that had felt too minor to report, but had accumulated into something crushing. Clara criticizing her cooking at family dinners. Ronald forgetting to tell her about social events until the last minute, then getting angry when she wasn't prepared. The way they'd isolated her from friends by creating emergencies or obligations that always seemed to come up when she made plans. And then the escalation. Ronald's temper getting worse. Grabbing her arm during arguments. Pushing her once, hard enough that she'd fallen and bruised her hip. Taking control of her car keys, her phone, her access to their joint bank account. Clara reinforcing every bit of it, telling Lynn she was too sensitive too emotional that she needed to be more understanding of Ronald's stress. Nora provided context for several of the entries, filling in details Lynn hadn't written down. This one, where she talks about the fight over visiting you for your birthday, Nora said, pointing to a journal page. She called me crying that night. Ronald had told her she was being selfish for wanting to leave him alone for the weekend. Clara had called and said family obligations came first. And since you weren't technically family anymore now that Lynn was married, she needed to prioritize Ronald's needs. That's not what family means, Everett said quietly. No, Martin agreed. It's not. By the time they finished, they had a comprehensive document detailing 18 months of systematic abuse. The evidence was overwhelming, not flashy or dramatic. No single incident that screamed domestic violence, but the accumulated weight of it painted an undeniable picture. This had been a sustained campaign to break Lynn down, isolate her, and control every aspect of her life. And when she'd finally gathered the courage to leave, she died. Martin organized everything into a folder. Original recordings, photos, journal, notes, letter, witness statements from Everett and Nora, the timeline they'd created. He made multiple copies, one for himself, one for Everett to keep at the clinic, one in a safe deposit box at his bank. He wasn't taking any chances. If something happened to one set of evidence, others would survive. I'm going to the county sheriff's office tomorrow, Martin said as they prepared to leave. I'll bring all of this and request they open an investigation into Lynn's death. Do you want us to come with you? Nora asked. Not yet. Let me feel them out first, see if they're willing to take this seriously. If they are, I'll arrange for both of you to give formal statements. Martin hefted his bag. In the meantime, don't talk to Ronald or Clara. Don't let them know we're doing this. The element of surprise is important. What if they ask why you're not around? Everett said, Ronald's been calling me, wanting to talk about planning some kind of memorial service for Lynn. Tell him I need time alone to grieve. Tell him I'm not ready to make decisions about services yet. Martin's expression hardened. Let him think I'm falling apart. Let him get comfortable. The worse he thinks I'm handling this, the less he'll be watching for me to come after him. They agreed. Everett walked Martin to the door, unlocked it, then locked it again after he left. Martin stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking up at the darkening sky. Rain was coming. He could smell it in the air, feel the pressure dropping. A storm rolling in from the west. Good. Let it storm. Let the weather match what was coming for the pages. They'd spent months making Lynn's life a nightmare. Now Martin was going to return the favor. Methodically. Precisely. Without mercy. He drove to the county seat, a larger town 20 miles east of Pine Brook. The sheriff's department occupied a modern building near the courthouse, all brick and glass and official looking. Martin parked and sat in his truck for a minute, staring at the entrance. Once he walked through those doors, everything would change. There would be no going back to comfortable denial, no maintaining the peace for the sake of social niceties. But Lynn's voice echoed in his mind. Make them pay. Martin grabbed his folder and walked inside. The reception area was busy, people waiting on benches, deputies moving through with paperwork, phones ringing. Martin approached the desk and told the officer there that he needed to speak with Sheriff Madsen about reopening an investigation into his daughter's death. The officer looked skeptical. Sir, if your local police department has already... I have new evidence, Martin interrupted. Evidence they didn't see. Evidence that suggests my daughter's death wasn't an accident. Something in his tone made the officer reconsider. He picked up his phone, spoke quietly for a moment, then nodded at Martin. Sheriff Madsen will see you. Follow me. They walked down a hallway to an office in the back. The nameplate on the door read Sheriff Eleanor Madsen. The officer knocked, opened the door, and gestured Martin inside. Sheriff Madsen stood up from behind her desk. She was in her early 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp blue eyes that assessed Martin immediately. She wore a uniform, badge gleaming on her chest, and when she shook Martin's hand, her grip was firm and professional. Mr. Calder, she said, please sit down. Deputy Morris said you have new evidence about your daughter's death. I do. Martin sat and placed the folder on her desk. Lynn died 2 weeks ago. The Pine Brook Police Department ruled it an accidental fall down the basement stairs. I don't believe that's what happened. And after going through her personal effects, I have substantial evidence to support my suspicion. Sheriff Madsen opened the folder. She pulled out the first item, one of the photographs showing bruises on Lynn's arm. Her expression didn't change, but Martin saw her posture shift slightly, saw the way her eyes focused with sudden intensity. She went through each piece of evidence methodically. Read Lynn's notes, studied the photos, looked at the timeline they'd created. When she got to Lynn's letter, she read it twice, her jaw tightening. "You have recordings as well?" she asked. Martin pulled out a small device from his pocket, a secondary copy of the flash drive contents on a digital audio player. 6 recordings made over the past 3 months. Lynn left them with her manager at work, along with instructions that if anything happened to her, they should be given to me. Sheriff Madsen listened to all 6 recordings. Her expression grew darker with each one. When the last one ended, Lynn's voice saying "make them pay," the sheriff set the device down carefully and looked at Martin. "This is clear evidence of ongoing domestic abuse," she said. "Physical, emotional, financial control. The pattern is unmistakable." The Pine Brook officer who investigated spent less than 2 hours at the scene, Martin said. He took Ronald's statement, looked at the stairs, and closed the case. He didn't interview neighbors. He didn't look for any evidence that contradicted the accident narrative. He and Ronald are friends. They play golf together. Sheriff Madsen's expression turned cold. "Officer Davidson, you know him. I know of him. This wouldn't be the first time his investigations have been, let's say, conveniently incomplete when it involves people he knows." She closed the folder and met Martin's eyes. "Mr. Calder, I'm going to be straight with you. What you've brought me is compelling, but it's not conclusive proof of homicide. The recordings and notes establish a pattern of abuse. The letter and witness statements show your daughter feared for her safety. But none of this directly proves her death wasn't an accident." Martin felt his stomach drop. "So you won't investigate?" "I didn't say that." Sheriff Madsen leaned back in her chair. "What I'm saying is that we need more. We need to establish opportunity. Who was home when she died, what the physical evidence at the scene actually shows, whether there are any inconsistencies in Ronald Page's account. We need to interview neighbors, co-workers, anyone who might have seen or heard something. We need to build a case that connects this pattern of abuse directly to her death. Will you do that?" Sheriff Madsen was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll open an investigation. Not as a homicide yet. We don't have enough for that. But as a suspicious death that warrants further inquiry. I'll assign one of my best investigators to review the original report, examine the scene, and conduct interviews." Relief flooded through Martin. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be difficult. Ronald and Clara Page will fight back. They'll lawyer up. They'll try to paint your daughter as mentally unstable, which from these notes appears to have been part of their strategy all along. And if Officer Davidson did a sloppy job on the initial investigation, which it sounds like he did, there may be evidence we can't recover now." "I understand. Do you?" Sheriff Madsen fixed him with a hard stare. "Because this investigation is going to dredge up every painful detail of your daughter's life. You're going to hear things you don't want to hear. You're going to have to watch while defense attorneys try to tear her apart posthumously. Are you prepared for that?" Martin thought of Lynn's voice on the recordings, scared and brave and trying so hard to survive. "Yes," he said. "I'm prepared." Sheriff Madsen nodded. "All right, leave this evidence with me. I'll make copies and get the investigation started. You should go home and wait. Don't approach Ronald or Clara. Don't tell anyone you've been here. Let's do our job. How long will it take? Depends on what we find. Could be weeks. Could be months. These things don't move fast." She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "But I promise you, Mr. Calder, we will be thorough. If there's evidence that your daughter's death was anything other than an accident, we will find it." Martin stood as well, shook her hand again. "That's all I'm asking for. The truth." He left the sheriff's office feeling lighter than he had since Lynn's funeral. Not happy. He couldn't be happy, not with Lynn gone, but purposeful. The wheels were turning now. The machinery of justice was beginning to move. And somewhere in Pine Brook, Ronald and Clara Page had no idea what was coming for them. Martin drove home as rain began to fall, fat drops splattering against his windshield. He thought about Lynn, about the girl she'd been before Ronald, before Clara, before all of it. Smart and kind and full of plans. She wanted to go to nursing school, maybe become a nurse practitioner eventually. She'd talked about traveling, seeing places beyond Pine Brook. She'd had dreams. They'd taken all of that from her. Piece by piece, they dismantled her until there was nothing left but fear and the desperate hope of escape. But she fought back in the only way she could. She'd documented everything. She'd left evidence. She'd made sure that even if the worst happened, the truth wouldn't die with her. And now Martin would see that truth through to its conclusion, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. He would watch Ronald and Clara's perfect facade crumble. He would watch their lies catch up to them. He would watch justice find them exactly where they stood. For Lynn, 3 weeks passed. Martin heard nothing from Sheriff Madsen's office. He went to work, came home, ate dinner alone, and waited. The waiting was torture, but he understood it. Investigations took time. Proper investigations, anyway. The kind where you actually looked at evidence instead of just accepting the most convenient story. Meanwhile, Ronald and Clara continued their performance. Ronald went back to work, told everyone he was taking it day by day, accepted casseroles and sympathy cards from neighbors. Clara attended her usual social events, speaking in somber tones about the tragedy of losing a daughter-in-law so young. They were settling into their roles as bereaved family members, secure in the belief that their version of events had been accepted. Martin avoided them. When Ronald called to discuss funeral arrangements, Martin kept the conversations brief and vague. When Clara left messages suggesting they have dinner together, he didn't return them. He played the role of the grieving father who couldn't quite function, who needed time alone. Let them think he was falling apart. Let them relax. On a Tuesday morning in mid-December, Martin's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Mr. Calder? This is Deputy James Wright from the County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Madsen asked me to contact you. We'd like you to come in for an update on the investigation. Martin's pulse quickened. When? Today, if possible. 2 o'clock. I'll be there. Martin arrived 15 minutes early. Deputy Wright met him in the lobby, a man in his 40s with dark hair and a serious demeanor. He led Martin to a conference room where Sheriff Madsen waited, along with 2 other people Martin didn't recognize. Mr. Calder, Sheriff Madsen said, gesturing to the chairs. Thank you for coming. Let me introduce Detective Lisa Hammond and Forensic Specialist David Chun. They've been working your daughter's case. Martin shook hands with both of them and sat down. His heart hammered in his chest. Detective Hammond opened a thick file. Mr. Calder, we spent the past 3 weeks conducting a thorough reinvestigation of your daughter's death. We've interviewed 14 people, neighbors, co-workers, friends. We've examined the physical evidence from the original scene, and we've found several significant inconsistencies with the accidental death theory. What kind of inconsistencies? First, the physical evidence. Lynn's injuries were consistent with a fall downstairs, but the location and pattern of bruising suggests she may have been pushed or shoved rather than simply losing her balance. There was bruising on her upper arms that indicates someone gripped her shortly before she fell. Martin's hands clenched into fists under the table. Chun pulled out several photographs. These are images from the autopsy that Officer Davidson apparently didn't consider significant. This bruising here on the right upper arm shows 4 distinct marks consistent with fingers. This would indicate someone grabbed her with significant force. The coroner noted it in his report, but marked it as possibly related to fall without further investigation. Someone grabbed her, Martin said, his voice tight. Who was home when she fell? According to Ronald Page's original statement, he was upstairs watching television, Detective Hammond said. He claims he didn't hear anything until he came downstairs around 8:30 to ask about dinner and found her at the bottom of the basement stairs. Do you believe that? We interviewed his neighbors. The Harpers lived next door. Mrs. Harper told us she heard raised voices coming from the Page house around 7:45 the evening Lynn died. She couldn't make out words, but she distinctly remembers thinking it sounded like an argument. She almost called to check on them, but decided not to get involved. Sheriff Madsen leaned forward. "We also interviewed a co-worker of yours at the mill, Tom Peterson. He lives 3 houses down from the Pages. He was taking out his trash that evening around 8 o'clock and saw Ronald standing in his driveway, smoking a cigarette. He remembers because Ronald never smokes outside. Clara doesn't allow it. Tom said Ronald looked agitated. So he was outside," Martin said slowly, "not upstairs watching TV. His timeline doesn't match witness accounts," Detective Hammond confirmed. "We also found that Ronald placed a call to his mother at 8:15. The call lasted 17 minutes. During that call, he never mentioned that anything was wrong, never said Lynn had fallen. He only called emergency services at 8:36, 21 minutes after talking to his mother." Martin felt cold spreading through his chest. He called Clara before he called for help. That's what the phone records show. Chin pulled out another document. "We also had an independent forensic pathologist review the autopsy report and photographs. She noted several things that concerned her. The head injury Lynn sustained was consistent with falling, but the bruising on her body, particularly on her back and ribs, suggests there may have been a prior physical altercation before the fall occurred. He beat her and then pushed her," Martin said. The words came out flat, emotionless, but inside he was screaming. "We can't prove that conclusively," Sheriff Madsen said carefully. "But the evidence strongly suggests Ronald Page's account of events is not accurate. Combined with the documentation of abuse your daughter left behind, we have enough to pursue charges." "What charges?" "We're building a case for negligent homicide and domestic assault. We have evidence of ongoing abuse. We have witness testimony that places Ronald outside the house during the critical time period, contradicting his statement. We have the phone records showing he called his mother before calling for help. We have autopsy findings that suggest a physical altercation preceded the fall. And we have your daughter's own words stating she feared for her safety." Martin closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, his voice was steady. "What about Clara?" Detective Hammond flipped through the file. "We retrieved text messages from Clara Page's phone. She and Ronald exchanged several messages in the days following Lynn's death. Messages that suggest she was helping him prepare a narrative about Lynn's mental instability. We also have texts between Clara and Ronald from weeks before Lynn died, where Clara explicitly tells him that Lynn is getting too difficult to manage and that he needs to handle her properly. She knew," Martin said. "She knew he was hurting Lynn. More than that," Sheriff Madsen said. "After Lynn died, Clara sent Ronald a text that read, 'Remember what we discussed.' She was always unstable. Stick to that. That's evidence of coaching a witness and potentially obstruction of justice. We're charging her as an accessory," Detective Hammond added. "Accessory to domestic violence, obstruction of justice, and interference with a death investigation. She actively helped cover up what happened." Martin sat back in his chair. His mind raced, piecing together the full picture. Ronald had been escalating. Lynn had been planning to leave. Something had happened that evening. An argument, maybe Lynn telling him she was done, and Ronald had lost control. He grabbed her, hurt her, and then pushed her down the basement stairs. And then, instead of calling for help immediately, he called his mother to figure out what story to tell. "When will you arrest them?" Martin asked. "Tomorrow morning," Sheriff Madsen said. "We have warrants prepared. We'll take Ronald at his workplace and Clara at her home. We wanted to inform you first, so you wouldn't be surprised when news gets out." "Thank you." Martin looked at each of them in turn. "Thank you for taking this seriously. For actually investigating instead of just accepting what you were told. Your daughter deserved that much," Detective Hammond said quietly. "She deserved someone to listen to what she was saying." The next morning, Martin woke early. He made coffee, sat at his kitchen table, and waited. At 9:30, his phone rang. It was Everett. "Martin, turn on the news." Channel 5. Martin grabbed the remote and turned on the small TV in his kitchen. The local news anchor was mid-sentence. "Arrested this morning in connection with the death of Lynn Calder Page. Ronald Page, 31, was taken into custody at his workplace on charges of negligent homicide and domestic assault. His mother, Clara Page, 62, was also arrested at her home on multiple charges, including accessory to domestic violence and obstruction of justice. Both are being held at the county jail pending arraignment. The screen showed footage of Ronald being led out of an office building in handcuffs. His face was red, angry. He was shouting something at the deputies, but the audio was muted. Then it cut to Clara's arrest. Her standing on her front lawn in a robe, officers on either side of her, her expression shocked. Martin watched without expression. No satisfaction. Not yet. This was just the beginning. They'd lawyer up. They'd fight. They'd try to spin this as a misunderstanding, persecution, anything but what it actually was. But now the truth was public. Now, people would start asking questions. Now the perfect facade Ronald and Clara had maintained would crack and crumble. His phone rang again. Nora this time. "Did you see?" she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw. They arrested them. They actually arrested them." She was crying. Lynn. Lynn would be so relieved. She'd be so grateful. She'd be alive, Martin corrected gently. But yes, she'd know we didn't let them win. The days following the arrests were chaos. The story spread through Pine Brook like wildfire. People who'd attended Lynn's funeral, who'd listened sympathetically to Ronald's grief, suddenly remembered things that hadn't seemed important before. Neighbors came forward with stories of hearing arguments. Co-workers admitted Lynn had seemed increasingly withdrawn in her final months. The narrative Ronald and Clara had carefully constructed began unraveling thread by thread. The Pages hired lawyers immediately, expensive ones from the city. They posted bail, $75,000 for Ronald, $50,000 for Clara, and returned home to find reporters camped on their lawn. Clara gave a brief statement through her attorney. "These charges are baseless. My son loved his wife. This is a tragic misunderstanding fueled by grief-stricken accusations." Martin didn't respond to media requests. He stayed home, worked his shifts at the mill, and let the sheriff's department handle the investigation. But he stayed in close contact with Detective Hammond, who kept him updated on new developments. They found Lynn's torn shirt in the trash. Clara had apparently tried to destroy it, but forensic analysis recovered blood stains that matched Lynn's. Defensive wounds suggested she'd raised her arms to protect herself. Text messages recovered from Ronald's phone showed escalating anger in the weeks before her death. One message to Clara read, "If she leaves, I'll make sure she regrets it." Another, "She's threatening to go to her father. We can't let that happen." Each piece of evidence built the case stronger. The forensic pathologist's report confirming prior physical trauma. The timeline that proved Ronald lied about his whereabouts. The witness statements from neighbors. Clara's text messages coaching Ronald on what to say. The financial records showing Ronald had cut off Lynn's access to their joint account 2 weeks before she died. And through it all, Lynn's own voice on those recordings, speaking from beyond death, telling the truth they tried so hard to bury. The arraignment came. Martin sat in the courtroom and watched as Ronald and Clara entered not guilty pleas. Ronald's lawyer argued that the charges were based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. Clara's lawyer claimed she'd done nothing wrong, that a few text messages didn't constitute obstruction. The judge wasn't swayed. He maintained their bail, but added conditions. Ankle monitors, no contact with each other or with witnesses, travel restrictions. Ronald's face when the judge read the conditions was a study in barely contained rage. This was a man used to control, used to getting his way, suddenly finding himself constrained and under scrutiny. He glared at Martin as he left the courtroom. Martin stared back, unmoved. The trial was set for April. For months away. For months of motions and discovery and legal maneuvering. For months of watching Ronald and Clara try every trick to make this go away. Martin was patient. He'd waited this long. He could wait longer. Christmas came and went. Martin spent it alone, looking through old photos of Lynn. Her, as a child, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. As a teenager, rolling her eyes at something he'd said. As a young woman at her college graduation, proud and hopeful. Before Ronald. Before Clara. Before everything went wrong. He wondered sometimes if he could have prevented this. If he'd paid closer attention, if he'd pushed harder when something fell off, if he'd made Lynn feel safer coming to him with the truth. But dwelling on what-ifs didn't help anyone. All he could do now was see justice through to its end. In January, Detective Hammond called with an update. We interviewed Lynn's doctor. She'd come in twice over the past year with injuries she claimed were from accidents. The doctor didn't suspect abuse at the time, but looking back, the pattern is obvious. He's willing to testify, more pieces falling into place. In February, a neighbor came forward who hadn't been home during the initial investigation. She'd been visiting family when Lynn died, but heard about the arrest and wanted to share what she knew. She'd seen Clara at the Page house the evening Lynn died, arriving around 7. Clara claimed she'd gone home before 8, but this witness said Clara's car was still in the driveway past 8:30. She remembered because she'd been walking her dog and thought it was odd Clara was there so late on a weeknight. Clara had lied about her whereabouts. She'd been there. She'd been there when Lynn died, or immediately after, and she'd helped Ronald figure out what to do. The charges against Clara were upgraded to include accessory after the fact to negligent homicide. March brought another development. A former friend of Ronald's came forward, someone he'd known in college who'd kept quiet until now. This man told investigators that Ronald had a history of explosive anger, that he'd been physically aggressive with a previous girlfriend, that there'd been an incident at a party where he'd grabbed someone who'd criticized him. The charges had been dropped back then because the victim didn't want to pursue them, but the pattern was clear. This wasn't Lynn's fault. This wasn't about her being too weak or too sensitive or unable to handle marriage. This was about Ronald being an abuser who'd carefully hidden it until he had someone trapped. April arrived. The trial began on a Monday morning, bright and unseasonably warm. Martin sat in the courtroom every day in the same seat, watching. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They started with Lynn's voice recordings, played them for the jury. Martin watched the jurors' faces as they listened to his daughter's fear, her pain, her growing desperation. Several jurors looked shaken. The defense tried to paint Lynn as mentally unstable, just as she'd predicted they would. They brought in a psychologist who'd never met Lynn, but testified about how stress could cause mood swings and irrational behavior. The prosecution countered with Lynn's co-workers, her friends, her doctor, all testifying that she'd been competent, stable, a good nurse who showed up for her shifts and did her job well. The instability only appeared in Ronald and Clara's accounts. Nowhere else. The forensic evidence was damning. The pathologist explained the bruising patterns, the timeline of injuries, the physical indicators that suggested Lynn had been in an altercation before her fall. The defense's expert witness couldn't explain away the fingerprint-shaped bruises on her arms or the evidence of prior trauma. The phone records destroyed Ronald's timeline. His lawyer tried to explain it away, claimed Ronald had been in shock, confused about the exact sequence of events. But the jury saw the truth. Ronald had called his mother before calling for help. He'd prioritized covering his tracks over saving Lynn's life. Clara's text messages sealed her fate. When the prosecution read them aloud, remember what we discussed. She was always unstable. Stick to that. The jury's expressions hardened. This wasn't a grieving mother-in-law. This was someone orchestrating a cover-up. The defense put Ronald on the stand. It was a mistake. Under cross-examination, his temper showed. When the prosecutor pushed him about the inconsistencies in his story, Ronald's voice rose. He became defensive, angry, argumentative. The calm, bereaved husband act crumbled. The jury saw who he really was, controlling, volatile, unable to accept challenge. Clara didn't testify. Her lawyer advised against it, but her absence spoke volumes. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Ronald Page, negligent homicide, domestic assault, evidence tampering, intimidation. Clara Page, accessory to domestic violence, obstruction of justice, interference with a death investigation, accessory after the fact. Martin sat perfectly still as the verdict was read. Ronald's face went white, then red. He started to stand, to shout something, but the bailiff grabbed his arm. Clara made a small, choked sound and covered her mouth with her hands. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. On the sentencing day, Martin was allowed to give a victim impact statement. He stood at the podium and looked at Ronald and Clara, both of them seated at the defense table, both of them refusing to meet his eyes. "My daughter was 28 years old," Martin said. His voice was steady, measured. "She was a nurse. She saved lives. She was kind and smart, and she had plans for her future. You took all of that from her. You spent years breaking her down, isolating her, making her feel small and worthless. And when she finally found the courage to leave, you killed her." Ronald's lawyer started to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. "You thought you'd get away with it," Martin continued. "You thought your story about her instability would stand. You underestimated her. Lynn knew what you were. She documented it. She left evidence. She made sure the truth wouldn't die with her. And because of that, because of her courage and clarity, even in the worst moments of her life, you're here now, facing justice." He paused, let the words sink in. "I don't forgive you. I will never forgive you. What you did was unforgivable. But I do have something to thank you for. You made sure I understood exactly who you are. And now everyone else does too." Martin sat down. The judge delivered the sentences. Ronald Page, 20 years for negligent homicide, concurrent sentences for the other charges. Minimum 12 years before parole eligibility. Clara Page, 8 years for accessory charges, 5 years probation after release. They were handcuffed and led away. Ronald was shouting now, claiming injustice, claiming he'd been railroaded. Clara was crying, but silently, her face turned away from the courtroom. Neither of them looked at Martin. He watched them go and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph. Just a hollow certainty that this was as close to justice as the world could provide. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Martin gave one statement. "My daughter's voice was heard. That's all that matters." He drove to Pine Brook, to the hill on the north side of town where Lynn used to watch sunsets. The same hill he'd stood on months ago, the day after her funeral. The dogwood tree planted in the memorial garden at the clinic had been her idea. Actually, she mentioned once that dogwoods were her favorite. Everett had remembered. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Martin stood there and thought about Lynn, about the girl she'd been, the woman she'd become, the future she deserved and never got. "We did it," he said quietly to the empty air. "We made sure they couldn't tell your story. We made sure everyone knows the truth." The wind picked up, rustling through the bare trees. Winter was ending. Spring coming. Life continuing, as it always did, whether you were ready or not. Martin had Lynn's letter in his pocket. He'd carried it with him throughout the trial, a reminder of why this mattered. Now he took it out, read it one more time, and walked down the hill to the memorial garden Everett had created at the clinic. The dogwood tree was still small, barely more than a sapling, but it was growing, new buds forming on the branches, preparing for bloom. Martin knelt beside it and dug a small hole in the soil with his hands. He placed the letter inside, carefully, and covered it over. "You didn't fail," he said. "They did, and now everyone knows it." He stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and looked at the young tree. Years from now, it would be strong and full. It would bloom every spring, white petals against blue sky, a living memorial to someone who'd fought as hard as she could with what she had. Martin wasn't healed. Grief didn't work that way. The hole Lynn left would always be there, an absence that couldn't be filled. But he had something close to peace. He had the truth, acknowledged and vindicated. He had justice, imperfect but real. And he had the certainty that Lynn's voice had been heard, that her story had been told correctly, that Ronald and Clara Page would spend years paying for what they'd done. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Martin turned and walked back to his truck. Behind him, the dogwood tree stood silently in the fading light, a promise of spring, of renewal, of memory that wouldn't fade. Lynn's truth had been told, and it would outlast any lie.